A man smiled at me and said, "We used to love each other." I told him I had never seen him before. Then he asked me to check my own phone. I met him on a Tuesday that felt forgettable even while it was happening. One of those days where time moves quietly and nothing feels important enough to remember later. I was standing in line at a cafe, scrolling through my phone, pretending to care about messages I'd already read twice, when a voice beside me said, "You still order it too sweet." And I smiled out of habit because strangers sometimes say strange things, and confidence often sounds like familiarity. But when I turned my head, the smile stayed frozen because the man looking at me was smiling, like someone who had just found something he had lost a long time ago, like someone who was sure I would recognize him if I only looked hard enough. And before I could say, "Sorry, wrong person," he added, "You used to say bitter coffee made you sad." And I laughed softly because it sounded rehearsed and oddly specific, and I told him he must have me confused with someone else, yet he didn't step back or look embarrassed or apologize the way strangers usually do. He only nodded slightly and said, "You used to say that too," and something shifted in my chest, not fear, not memory. Just a strange pull like deja vu without the picture attached. So I asked him who he was, expecting him to hesitate or joke, but instead he said my name clearly and carefully, like it mattered, not asking, but stating. And when I asked if I was supposed to know him, his eyes searched my face as if he were scanning for damage. Then he asked quietly, "You really don't remember me?" And I shook my head, feeling suddenly exposed like I was missing something obvious. He exhaled slowly and said, "We dated for almost 2 years." And I laughed louder this time because it sounded impossible, because I would remember something like that. I would remember loving someone for 2 years. And when I told him this wasn't funny and that he had the wrong person, he didn't argue or defend himself. He only said, "You didn't forget everything, you just forgot me," which should have sounded ridiculous, but somehow didn't. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone before stopping himself and saying, "No, it's better if you see it on yours." And when he told me to check my photos from June 2 years ago, I hesitated because it felt theatrical and invasive. But curiosity pressed harder than logic, so I scrolled past receipts, screenshots, meals, sunsets until my thumb stopped on a photo that made my breath leave my body. Because it was me laughing, leaning into a man with my arm around his shoulder, and the man was standing in front of me now. And when I looked up at him, my hands were shaking, while my mind stayed eerily empty, so I whispered, "Who are you?" And he swallowed like he had been holding that answer for years and said, "I'm the man you loved before you forgot me." I stood there staring at him while the cafe noise faded into something distant and unreal. Cups clinking, voices overlapping, steam hissing. Yet all I could hear was my own pulse pounding in my ears as I looked back down at my phone and zoomed into the photo as if closer inspection might explain how this version of me could exist without my permission. My smile looked real. Not posed, not polite, but relaxed and unguarded. The kind of smile you wear around someone who knows you deeply. And that frightened me more than anything else, because I didn't recognize the girl in the picture even though she was clearly me. And when I scrolled further, my chest tightened as more photos appeared. Us sitting on the floor surrounded by takeout boxes. Us walking at night holding hands. Us laughing on a couch under a blanket. Moments that didn't look special enough to fake and didn't look dramatic enough to be staged. They looked lived in, and I whispered, "This isn't possible," as if saying it softly might undo it. But he didn't interrupt or rush me. He just stood there watching me relive a life he remembered too well, and when I finally asked why I didn't remember any of it, he hesitated before saying, "You told me once that forgetting was easier than saying." And I laughed nervously because that sounded like something a writer would say, not something I would ever admit out loud. Yet the way he said it made it feel stolen from my own mouth. I asked him how we met, and he smiled sadly and said, "You sat next to me on a train and complained about the silence." And that detail hit me hard, because I do hate silence, but I had never told anyone that recently. And when I asked him why there were no messages, no calls, no proof beyond photos, he told me to check my archived chats, and my fingers felt heavy as I tapped through folders I had never opened before until I found his name muted, hidden, preserved like something dangerous. And when I opened it, my throat tightened, because the messages weren't romantic. They were raw, messy, full of late-night doubts, voice notes, apologies, promises, reminders of ordinary love that doesn't perform. And the last message was from me saying, "Please don't try to find me if I forget again." And I stared at those words, feeling like I had just read a confession written by a stranger wearing my face. So I asked him what he meant by again, and he looked away for the first time and said, "This isn't the first time you've forgotten me." And suddenly the air felt too thin, and the world tilted slightly, because forgetting once could be an accident, but forgetting twice felt deliberate. And I realized with a quiet, creeping dread that whatever had erased him from my memory might still be inside me, watching, waiting, ready to do it again. If you found proof you erased someone you loved on purpose, would you want to remember them again or stay safe in forgetting? I wanted to step away from him, but my body refused to move, as if staying still might keep the truth from advancing any further. So instead, I asked him to sit with me, and he followed without hesitation, like this was a routine he had practiced. And we took a small table near the window where the light felt softer and less judgmental. And I wrapped my hands around my coffee, even though I had no intention of drinking it, because I needed something warm to hold, while my mind tried to rearrange itself. And I asked him to tell me everything slowly from the beginning, because if I was going to rebuild something that had been erased, I needed to choose every brick myself. And he nodded and said, "You said that the first time too," which sent a chill through me, even though he hadn't raised his voice. So he started talking about ordinary things, the way we met, how we argued about music, how I hated making plans but panicked without them, details that felt intimate and invasive at the same time. And with every sentence, I felt closer to a memory that refused to surface, like a word stuck on the tip of my tongue. And when I told him it felt unfair to expect me to feel something for a past I couldn't access, he said, "I'm not asking you to feel anything. I just don't want you to think." I imagined us, and I believed him, because imagination doesn't ache the way his voice did. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn thin at the edges and said, "You gave me this after the first time you forgot." And when I opened it, my chest tightened because it was written in my handwriting, careful, deliberate, unmistakable, and it said, "If you are reading this, then I have forgotten you again. Please don't hate me for choosing to survive." And I read it twice then, a third time, because survival from what was the question echoing in my head. And when I asked him what happened the first time, he hesitated longer this time before saying, "You had a breakdown after the accident." And the doctor said memory gaps were normal. And the word accident landed heavily between us because I had no memory of that either. And when I asked why no one had told me, he said, "You asked them not to, that you were terrified of becoming the girl who was only remembered for what she lost." And something about that felt painfully familiar, like a fear I had carried quietly my entire life. And I suddenly wondered how many choices I had made that were no longer mine to remember. And as I sat there, holding a letter from myself, written to protect a future version I didn't know existed, I realized the scariest part wasn't that I had forgotten him, it was that some version of me had decided forgetting was safer than love. Do you think forgetting pain is a form of strength or a kind of escape that costs too much? I asked him about the accident even though every instinct in my body warned me not to, because there are questions that once spoken refuse to stay contained. And he leaned back in his chair like someone preparing to reopen an old wound that never fully closed. Then he said it wasn't dramatic the way accidents are in movies. No screeching tires, no shattered glass, no heroic rush to the hospital, just a wet road, a missed signal, a quiet impact that left my body mostly untouched but shook something loose inside my head. And as he spoke, I felt an odd pressure behind my eyes, like my brain was trying to protect itself by staying blank. And when he told me I had walked away, smiling, insisting I was fine, even while repeating the same question 3 times, I felt a cold ripple move through me because I do that now too. And I asked him why he stayed after the first time I forgot him when he could have walked away, spared himself this strange, recurring heartbreak. And he smiled sadly and said, "Because you still felt like you, even without the memories, and because loving you was never about being remembered." And that should have comforted me, but instead it scared me because it meant he would stay even if I erased him again. And I wondered if love without memory was devotion or self-destruction. And when I asked what made me forget him, specifically, and not everything else, he looked down at his hands and said, "Because every time you got close to remembering, the panic returned and you begged me to help you forget again." And that sentence echoed in my chest like a betrayal, written in my own voice. And I felt a sudden anger rise not at him, but at the version of me who had made decisions that trapped me in this loop without my consent. And I told him it felt cruel to let me live a life edited by fear, and he said, "You didn't think of it as fear, you called it mercy." And I laughed bitterly because mercy for who was the question I couldn't answer. And when I asked him what he wanted from me now, he was quiet for a long moment before saying nothing more than honesty and time, not to reclaim the past, but to let the present exist without secrets. And that felt reasonable and impossible at the same time, because how do you trust a mind that has already erased its own warnings? And as we sat there in silence, watching people pass by, unaware of the quiet fracture happening inside me, I realized that the danger wasn't remembering him or forgetting him again. It was discovering that the person I trusted least in this story was myself. If you learned your past self made choices to protect you, would you honor them or try to undo them? I didn't plan to see him again after that day, yet somehow the decision made itself without asking me, because the next morning there was a message waiting on my phone from a number I hadn't saved but somehow trusted. It said I left the letter with you in case you wanted to read it again, and I realized with a strange calm that I had already chosen not to block him, and that frightened me more than if I had. So I replied with a simple, "Okay," and told myself it was only for answers, not for attachment. But when we met again, it felt less like a confrontation and more like a continuation. Paused mid-sentence, and he suggested places we used to go without calling them memories. A park bench near the river, a bookstore that smelled like dust and rain, and each place stirred something small and sharp inside me. Not images, but sensations like the echo of footsteps or the weight of a hand that wasn't there. And when he asked if any of it felt familiar, I shook my head, even though that wasn't entirely true. Because familiarity doesn't always arrive as recognition. Sometimes it comes as discomfort. And as we walked, he pointed out things I had loved before the sound of trains passing overhead, the way pigeons lined up like gossiping old men. And I hated that he knew me so well, because it felt like being seen by someone who remembered a version of me I no longer controlled. And when we sat by the river, he told me about the rules I had made after the first time I forgot. No surprises, no sudden loud noises, no forcing memories. And hearing that made me ache, because it meant I had been afraid of myself long before I met him again. And when I asked him if I was happy back then, he paused before saying, "You were intense and alive and terrified of losing control." And that answer lingered uncomfortably because it sounded like me now too. And as the afternoon faded, I felt a growing tension between wanting to reclaim what I lost and wanting to protect the fragile peace I had built without it. And when he reached for my hand, then stopped, halfway waiting for permission, I felt tears sting my eyes because the hesitation meant he remembered my boundaries, even when I didn't. And I let him take my hand, not because it felt right, but because it felt honest. And in that moment, something flickered behind my eyes. Not a memory, but a warning, like standing too close to a fire you once burned yourself on. And I realized that whatever had been erased wasn't just love. It was something dangerous, something overwhelming, something my mind had decided was too much to carry. And as I pulled my hand back gently, I knew that finding the truth might not heal me, it might undo me completely. Would you keep walking toward a truth if you knew it once broke you? That night, I dreamed for the first time in weeks, and the dream felt heavier than the others because it refused to fade when I woke up. It wasn't clear or cinematic. It was fragmented like a room seen through cracked glass, a hospital corridor stretching too long, lights buzzing overhead, someone calling my name again and again with a voice that carried panic and love in equal measure. And when I opened my eyes, my heart was racing. and my hands were damp as if my body remembered something my mind was still blocking. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how many nights like this I had erased without knowing. Then my phone vibrated, and for a moment I considered not looking at it because I was afraid of what familiarity might unlock. But it was only a message from him asking if I was okay, and the timing unsettled me enough that I typed yes, even though it wasn't true. And later that afternoon, I agreed to meet him again, not because I felt brave, but because I was tired of circling the edges of my own life. And we met at the bookstore he said I used to love. And the moment I stepped inside, the smell of paper and dust wrapped around me so tightly that my breath caught, and suddenly my head throbbed sharply and I had to grip the shelf to steady myself, and he noticed immediately, stepping closer, but not touching like he had learned restraint the hard way. And he asked if I wanted to leave, but I shook my head because something in that pain felt like progress. And as I moved through the aisles, certain titles made my chest ache without explanation. And when I picked one up, my vision blurred briefly and I heard laughter echo faintly like it was coming from underwater. And I whispered, "What is happening to me?" And he said softly, "Memories don't always return as pictures. Sometimes they come back as storms." And that terrified me because storms don't ask permission. And when I told him I was scared of what remembering might do to me, he didn't try to reassure me with empty promises. He only said I was scared too the first time and the second. And that honesty grounded me more than comfort ever could. And as we sat on the floor between shelves like we apparently used to, I felt a sudden rush of emotion that didn't belong to the present moment. Grief, longing, anger, love all tangled together, and tears slid down my face without warning, and I didn't even know what I was crying for, and he didn't touch me or speak. He just stayed, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. And in that silence, I understood something crucial, that my mind hadn't erased him to punish me or protect him, but to save me from drowning in feelings too intense to process. And as I wiped my face and took a shaky breath, I realized that remembering wouldn't be a gentle return. It would be a fight between who I was and who I chose to become. If your memories returned as pain before clarity, would you still want them back? The next memory didn't arrive gently. It arrived like a crack splitting open something I had sealed too tightly. Because later that evening, as I washed my hands in my apartment bathroom, the sound of running water shifted suddenly into something else, and I was no longer standing on cold tiles, but sitting in the driver's seat of a car with rain blurring the windshield, and my hands clenched around the steering wheel so hard they hurt, and my breath shortened as panic rushed in without context. And when I stumbled back against the sink gasping, I realized with shaking certainty that the accident wasn't just something that happened to me, it was something I caused, and that thought lodged itself deep and heavy in my chest. So when he came over after my shaky text asking him to, I didn't know what I would say, but I knew I couldn't be alone with that realization. And when I told him I remembered driving that night, his face drained of color, and he sat down slowly like his body already knew where the story was going. And he told me I had insisted on driving because I was angry and exhausted and determined to prove I was fine. And I asked him angry about what, and he hesitated before saying about us, because I had accused him of trying to control me, of worrying too much, of loving me like I was fragile. And hearing that stung, because it sounded like something I would say when I felt cornered by care. And when I pressed him further, he finally said the part I wasn't ready for, that I had been spiraling for weeks before the accident, barely sleeping, oscillating between intensity and emptiness, terrified that loving someone so deeply meant losing myself completely. And when I asked why no one stopped me, he said they tried, including him, and I pushed them away one by one. And the weight of that truth pressed down on me until my throat tightened, because forgetting suddenly felt less like protection and more like consequence. And I asked him if he blamed me, and he answered without hesitation, never for the accident, never for forgetting, only for not trusting myself enough to ask for help. And that answer broke something open because I had expected anger, not grace. And as the evening stretched on, I realized the most painful memory wasn't the crash or the fear or even the forgetting. It was the version of me who believed love required self-erasure to survive. And as I sat there listening to a man who had loved me through my own disappearance, I understood why my mind had chosen silence over truth. Because remembering meant facing not just what I lost, but who I was when I lost it. If remembering meant confronting a version of yourself you don't like, would you still want the truth? After that night, something fragile shifted between us because the truth was no longer a distant concept, but a living thing sitting in the room with us. And I felt exposed in a way I couldn't articulate, like someone had turned on a light inside my chest and left it there. And when he left, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat on the floor, surrounded by pieces of a life I half remembered, trying to decide which parts were mine to reclaim and which had already done enough damage. And the next morning, I woke with a headache that felt earned and a calm that felt suspicious, because clarity often arrives wearing the mask of peace before it demands payment. And I knew I couldn't keep drifting between remembering and hiding. So I asked him to meet me one last time at the river where everything had felt both familiar and wrong. And when he arrived, he looked cautious, like someone approaching an animal that might bolt. And I told him I needed honesty without protection, without softening, without fear of breaking me. And he nodded because he had always been better at truth than comfort. And I asked him if loving me had hurt him, and this time he didn't avoid it. He said yes more than he expected and less than he regretted. And that answer felt heavier than any accusation because it carried choice inside it. And I asked him if I ever loved him the way he loved me, and he smiled faintly and said, "You loved me fiercely until you were afraid of losing yourself, and then you tried to disappear." And hearing that finally unlocked the grief I had been circling, because it meant the forgetting wasn't random. It was an escape route, built slowly and deliberately. And I started crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, like something long held was finally being released. And he didn't rush to stop it because he understood that this was the part I needed to feel fully. And when the tears slowed, I told him I was scared that remembering everything would undo the fragile stability I had built since the accident. And he said, maybe, but pretending it never happened was already undoing you quietly. And that truth cut sharply because it felt undeniable. And as we sat there watching the water move forward without hesitation, I realized that healing wasn't about choosing memory or forgetting, it was about choosing responsibility. And I told him I didn't know if I could love him again, not because he wasn't worthy, but because I wasn't sure who I would become if I did. And he said, loving you was never about keeping you. It was about letting you choose yourself, even when that choice wasn't me. And that was the moment I understood why my past self trusted him enough to leave letters and rules and warnings, because he was never the danger I was running from. And as the sun dipped lower and the day softened, I knew the breaking point wasn't losing him again. It was finally deciding to stop running from myself. Is healing about reclaiming the past or choosing differently when you finally understand it? The days after that conversation moved slowly and deliberately, as if my life had decided to give me space to think instead of pushing me forward. And I didn't see him during that time, not because we agreed to distance, but because I needed to know who I was when no one was reminding me of who I used to be. And I spent those days doing small, ordinary things with unusual attention, walking without headphones, cooking without rushing, sitting in silence long enough to feel uncomfortable and then longer until it softened and memories came in flashes. Not dramatic scenes, but sensations like the weight of his jacket on my shoulders, the sound of his laugh when he tried not to laugh, the feeling of being seen too clearly. And instead of pushing them away, I acknowledged them gently, like you would a wave knowing it will pass. And I realized that the fear that once drove me to forget wasn't about love itself. It was about losing autonomy inside intensity. And that distinction mattered because it meant forgetting had been a flawed solution to a real problem. And when I finally reached out to him, it wasn't from loneliness or guilt, but from clarity. And we met at the same cafe where this story began. Not because it was symbolic, but because it felt honest to return without drama. And when he saw me, he didn't search my face for signs of memory. He simply asked, "How are you?" and waited for a real answer. And I told him the truth, that I remembered more now, but not everything, and that I was learning to hold what returned without letting it consume me. And he listened the way he always had, with patience that didn't ask for reward. And I told him I couldn't promise that forgetting would never happen again. And he said neither could I promise I wouldn't be hurt by it. And somehow saying those things out loud felt like trust instead of risk. And we talked about boundaries, not rules this time, but agreements about space, honesty, support, and I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not passion, not fear, but steadiness. And as we left the cafe together, I noticed my reflection in the window. And for the first time, it felt cohesive, like the girl before and after the accident were no longer strangers passing in the same body. And I understood then that remembering him wasn't about reclaiming a lost love story. It was about reclaiming agency. And as we walked side by side without holding hands, I felt more present than I had in years, because love no longer felt like something that would erase me, but something that would meet me where I stood. And that difference changed everything. Can love exist safely when both people accept uncertainty instead of guarantees? I used to think the story ended when memory returned or stayed gone, but now I understand that endings are quieter than that and more honest. Because the final choice wasn't about whether I would remember him fully or love him again the same way. It was about whether I would keep choosing myself, even when it felt easier to disappear. And in the weeks that followed, we moved carefully, not forward, not backward, just present, building something slower than what we had before, and stronger because it didn't rely on intensity to feel real. And memories continued to surface unevenly some days, bringing warmth, some days bringing grief, and instead of panicking, I learned to let them exist without letting them define me. And there were moments when I looked at him and felt nothing familiar, and moments when a glance or a phrase stirred something deep and old, but neither frightened me anymore because I trusted myself to stay. And one evening, as we sat together quietly, he asked if I ever wished I could erase it all again, and I surprised myself by answering no. Not because it hadn't hurt, but because forgetting had cost me something more dangerous than pain, which was choice. And I told him that remembering didn't mean reliving it, meant learning from it and allowing myself to be different this time. And he smiled, not sadly, not hopefully, just softly, like someone who had waited long enough to stop needing certainty. And I realized then that love wasn't the thing I needed to fear losing myself inside. Silence was. Avoidance was. Pretending I was fine when I wasn't was. And as months passed, my life no longer felt divided into before and after, but connected by intention. And the accident became part of my story without being its definition. And the forgetting became something I acknowledged without letting it excuse me from responsibility. And one day, while organizing my phone, I found the letter I'd written to him years ago. And instead of feeling haunted, I felt gratitude for the version of me who had tried to survive the only way she knew how. And I added a new note beneath it, written for myself this time, that said, "Remembering is not the same as returning, and healing does not require punishment." And when I showed it to him, he didn't comment. He just held my hand with a familiarity that felt earned, not assumed. And I understood that whether or not this love lasted forever was no longer the measure of its worth. Because the real resolution wasn't ending up together or apart. It was ending the cycle of fear that once convinced me forgetting was the only way to stay whole. And as I looked at him, then fully present, fully chosen, I knew that even if memory failed me again, I would not lose myself this time. Because I finally trusted the woman I was becoming more than the girl I had been afraid to remember.